The bitter wind howled through the cracks of the weathered jailhouse, a sound that sent shivers through Harriet Turner as she huddled in the corner of the cell, her cotton dress offering little protection against the merciless December cold of 1875. Sheriff Dalton had locked her in the unheated cell 6 hours ago, punishing her for a crime she hadn't committed, while the temperature outside plummeted to well below freezing in the small town of Silverpine, Colorado. "Gonna teach you a lesson about respecting the law in these parts," he'd snarled before slamming the iron door, taking the only blanket with him. Harriet wrapped her arms around her knees, her fingers numb and lips turning blue. At 22, she'd endured much in her young life, losing her parents to cholera 2 years ago, making the arduous journey west on her own, and now being accused of stealing from the general store where she'd worked for the past month. Mr. Jenkins, the store owner, had reported missing money, and Sheriff Dalton had decided she was the culprit without evidence or a proper hearing. "It's always the newcomers," he'd said, eyeing her with contempt. "Especially women with no men to vouch for their character." The town of Silverpine sat nestled in the mountains, beautiful in summer but harsh and unforgiving in winter. Snow had been falling steadily since morning, and as night approached, the temperature continued to drop. Harriet could see her breath forming clouds in front of her face. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably as she rocked back and forth, desperately trying to generate warmth. She thought she might die here, forgotten in this cell, a victim of a lawman's prejudice and a town's indifference. Tears froze on her cheeks as she imagined her body being discovered come morning, stiff and cold like the icicles hanging from the roof. The sound of boots stomping on the wooden porch outside startled her. The door to the sheriff's office burst open, letting in a gust of frigid air and a tall figure dusted with snow. "Dalton." A deep voice boomed. "What in God's name are you thinking?" Harriet recognized the voice. It belonged to Ethan Reynolds, one of the most respected cattle ranchers in the territory. She'd only seen him from a distance at the general store, an imposing figure who kept to himself, but was known for his fair dealings. "Now, Reynolds, this ain't your business," came Sheriff Dalton's defensive reply. "The girl stole from Jenkins. She's serving her time. In an unheated cell during the worst cold snap in years. That's not justice, that's murder." Ethan's voice was cold with fury. "Mrs. Wilson saw Jenkins' son Tommy pocketing money from the till this afternoon. The boy confessed to his mother an hour ago." Silence followed, then the shuffling of reluctant feet. "I'll need to verify that," the sheriff muttered. "You do that," Ethan replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But that woman comes out of that cell right now, or I'm riding to Denver myself to speak with the federal marshal about your methods." More shuffling, then the jangle of keys. Harriet looked up as the cell door swung open. Sheriff Dalton stood there, not meeting her eyes. "Seems there's been a misunderstanding," he mumbled, before quickly retreating to his office. Ethan Reynolds stepped into view, his tall frame filling the doorway. His dark hair was dusted with melting snow, and his eyes, a striking blue that reminded Harriet of summer skies, assessed her condition with alarm. "Miss Turner, can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Harriet tried to rise, but her legs had lost all feeling. She stumbled, and would have fallen if Ethan hadn't crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, catching her against his chest. "You're frozen through," he said, concern evident in his voice. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, felt like salvation. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her chattering teeth. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, scooping her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. "We need to get you warm before frostbite sets in." As he carried her out of the jailhouse, Harriet caught sight of Sheriff Dalton's face, a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. But she couldn't focus on him. All her attention was on the warmth slowly seeping into her from Ethan's coat, and the steady beat of his heart against her ear as he held her against his chest. Outside, the snow was falling heavily, blanketing the town in white. Ethan's horse, a magnificent black stallion, stood tethered to the hitching post, pawing the ground impatiently. "I'm taking you to Doc Miller's," Ethan said, settling her carefully in his saddle before mounting behind her. He wrapped one strong arm around her waist to keep her secure while he took the reins with his free hand. "He'll know how to treat the cold exposure." As they rode through the deserted streets, Harriet leaned back against Ethan's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. She didn't know why this man, practically a stranger, had come to her rescue, but in that moment, she was simply grateful that he had. "Why?" she managed to ask through her shivers. "Why did you help me?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, the only sound the crunch of his horse's hooves in the fresh snow. "Because it was right," he finally said, his voice rumbling in his chest against her back. "And because no one deserves to be treated that way, especially not someone who's innocent." The town doctor's house was on the outskirts of Silver Pine, a modest cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. Before Ethan could even knock, the door swung open to reveal a gray-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Brought you a patient, Doc," Ethan said, carrying Harriet inside. Doc Miller took one look at her and frowned deeply. "Put her by the fire. How long was she in that cell?" "At least 6 hours, from what I gather," Ethan replied, gently setting Harriet down in an armchair close to the roaring hearth. "Dalton's gone too far this time," the doctor muttered, quickly examining Harriet's hands and face. "Miss Turner, can you feel your fingers and toes?" "They're starting to tingle," she replied, the pain of returning circulation making her wince. "That's a good sign," Doc Miller said, turning to prepare something at his workbench. "Though you'll be in considerable discomfort for a while." While the doctor worked, Ethan knelt beside Harriet's chair. "I'll pay for your treatment," he said quietly, "and I'll see that Jenkins makes a public apology for the false accusation." Harriet looked at him in surprise. "Why would you do all this for me? You don't even know me." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "I know enough. I've seen you at the store, how you help the Mexican families who can't read English labels, how you slipped that candy to the Wilsons' youngest when his mother couldn't afford it." He paused. "This town was quick to judge you because you're an outsider with no connections. I know what that's like." Before Harriet could respond, Doc Miller returned with a steaming mug. "Drink this," he instructed. "It'll help warm you from the inside." The hot drink was bitter but soothing as it spread warmth through Harriet's body. As the feeling gradually returned to her extremities, the doctor carefully examined each finger and toe, nodding with satisfaction. "You're lucky, Miss Turner. No frostbite, though you came dangerously close. You'll need to stay warm tonight, and I want to check on you in the morning." He looked at Ethan. "She shouldn't be alone tonight in case there are delayed effects from the exposure." Ethan nodded. "Mrs. Donovan at the boarding house will look after her." "I can't pay for," Harriet began, but Ethan cut her off. "It's taken care of," he said firmly. "And tomorrow we'll sort out matters with Jenkins and the sheriff." Harriet wanted to protest but found she lacked the strength. The warmth of the fire, combined with the relief of being safe and the effects of the doctor's drink, was making her drowsy. The next thing she knew, she was being carried again, cradled against Ethan's chest as he walked through the snow toward the town's only boarding house. She should have felt embarrassed by the intimacy of the situation, but all she could feel was gratitude and a curious sense of safety in this stranger's arms. "Mrs. Donovan," A plump, kindly widow who ran the boarding house met them at the door, clucking her tongue in dismay when Ethan explained the situation. "That Dalton's got the sense God gave a fence post," she declared, leading them to a small but clean room with a bed covered in thick quilts. "Put her down here, Mr. Reynolds. I'll fetch some hot bricks for the bed and make up a warming pan." Once Harriet was settled in the bed, propped up against pillows with blankets tucked around her, Mrs. Donovan shooed Ethan toward the door. "I'll take good care of her now, Mr. Reynolds. A young lady needs her privacy." Ethan paused at the doorway, his eyes meeting Harriet's. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on you," he said, and though his expression remained serious, there was a gentleness in his voice that made her heart flutter. After he left, Mrs. Donovan helped Harriet change into a borrowed nightgown, exclaiming over the chill still lingering in her skin. The older woman placed hot bricks wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed and fussed, until she was satisfied Harriet was comfortable. "That Ethan Reynolds, Mrs. Donovan said as she adjusted the blankets one last time, "is a good man, though he keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife and baby son to fever 5 years back. Hasn't been the same since." She gave Harriet a meaningful look. "First time I've seen him take an interest in anyone's welfare in a long while." Harriet didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply thanked the woman for her kindness. As Mrs. Donovan left, Harriet settled deeper into the blessed warmth of the bed, her thoughts turning to the tall rancher with the intense blue eyes who had saved her from a night that might have been her last. She wondered why a man who clearly preferred solitude had gone out of his way to help her, and what Mrs. Donovan had meant about him taking an interest. Perhaps it was simply his sense of justice, as he'd said. Yet as sleep claimed her, Harriet couldn't help but hope there might be more to it than that. Morning came with golden light filtering through the curtains and the distant sounds of the town coming to life. Harriet woke feeling stiff and sore, but the dangerous chill had left her body. She sat up slowly, testing her limbs. Her fingers and toes still tingled uncomfortably, but she could move them without too much pain. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Donovan's entrance, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of porridge and a cup of hot coffee. "How are you feeling this morning, dear?" the older woman asked, setting the tray across Harriet's lap. "Much better, thank you," Harriet replied, suddenly aware of her rumbling stomach. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the previous day. "Dr. Miller will be by later to check on you, Mrs. Donovan informed her as she bustled about the room, opening the curtains wider to let in more light. "And Mr. Reynolds stopped by earlier, said he had some business to attend to in town but would return this afternoon." Harriet felt her cheeks warm at the mention of Ethan, remembering the solid strength of his arms as he'd carried her through the snow. "He's been very kind," she murmured, focusing on her porridge. Mrs. Donovan replied with a knowing smile. "He paid for a week's lodging for you here, by the way. Said you'd need time to recover properly." "A week?" Harriet exclaimed. "But I can't accept." Mrs. Donovan waved her protests away. "That man's got more money than he knows what to do with, and it's the first time he's spent any of it on something besides cattle and land in years. Let him do this good deed." After breakfast, with Mrs. Donovan's help, Harriet managed to wash and dress in a borrowed gown that was a bit too large but clean and warm. She was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the townspeople go about their morning business, when there was another knock at her door. Dr. Miller entered, his medical bag in hand. "Good morning, Miss Turner. I see you're up and about, which is an excellent sign." He examined her thoroughly, paying special attention to her extremities. "The color's good," he pronounced, "and there's no sign of lasting damage. You're a fortunate young woman, Miss Turner, another hour or two in that cell." He left the sentence unfinished, his expression grim. "Will I be able to return to work soon?" Harriet asked, thinking of her precarious financial situation. Without her job at the general store, she had no means of supporting herself. The doctor hesitated. "I'd recommend at least a few days of rest. The body takes time to recover from such an ordeal." He patted her hand. "But I understand your concern. Perhaps we can find a compromise light duties after a day or two." After the doctor left, Harriet found herself restless. The room, though comfortable, felt confining after her hours in the jail cell. Making a decision, she wrapped herself in a shawl Mrs. Donovan had lent her and made her way downstairs. The boarding house's small parlor was empty, and Harriet settled herself in a chair by the front window, watching the activity on the main street. The snow had stopped, but a thick white blanket covered everything, glittering in the midday sun. She didn't have to wait long before a commotion drew her attention. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, and at its center stood Ethan Reynolds, his tall figure unmistakable even from a distance. Beside him was a nervous-looking man whom Harriet recognized as Mr. Jenkins, the general store owner. Curious, she opened the front door and stepped onto the boarding house porch, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders against the cold. "I want everyone to hear this," Ethan was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp winter air. "Mr. Jenkins has something to say regarding Miss Harriet Turner." Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable under the gaze of the assembled townspeople. "I made a mistake," he announced. "Miss Turner didn't steal from my store. It was my son. The boy's been taking small amounts for weeks, and I wrongly accused Miss Turner when I discovered money missing." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Sheriff Dalton stood to one side, his expression sour. "Furthermore," Mr. Jenkins continued, glancing nervously at Ethan, "I want to publicly apologize to Miss Turner for the false accusation and for the suffering it caused her. Her position at the store is open to her whenever she's well enough to return, with a raise in wages to compensate for this injustice." More murmurs, some approving, others skeptical. Harriet felt a lump form in her throat at this vindication. Ethan stepped forward again. "There's one more matter to address," he said, turning to Sheriff Dalton. "The treatment Miss Turner received while in your custody was inexcusable. Leaving anyone, let alone an innocent woman, in an unheated cell during freezing weather is criminal negligence at best, attempted murder at worst." Dalton's face flushed red. "Now see here, Reynolds, I've already sent a telegram to the federal marshal in Denver." Ethan cut him off. "He'll be arriving next week to investigate. In the meantime, I suggest you consider your future in law enforcement very carefully." The sheriff's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Never before had anyone in Silverpine challenged his authority so directly. The crowd began to disperse, many casting sympathetic glances toward the boarding house where Harriet stood on the porch. Ethan spotted her and broke away from the group, striding purposefully in her direction. "You should be resting," he said as he reached her, concern evident in his eyes. "I heard the commotion," she explained, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his intense gaze. "Thank you for what you did. For clearing my name." Ethan shrugged, as if orchestrating a public apology and threatening a sheriff with federal investigation was an everyday occurrence. It was the right thing to do. Mrs. Donovan appeared at the door behind Harriet. "Miss Turner needs to come inside before she catches her death," she declared. "And Mr. Reynolds, since you're here, you might as well join us for lunch." Ethan looked like he might refuse, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan. I'd be glad to." The boarding house dining room was empty save for Harriet and Ethan. Mrs. Donovan served them a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread before tactfully withdrawing to the kitchen, leaving them alone. For several minutes, they ate in silence. Harriet sneaked glances at Ethan, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands, though large and clearly accustomed to hard work, handled his cutlery with unexpected grace. "Why did you go to so much trouble for me?" she finally asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Ethan paused, setting down his spoon. "I told you, it was the right thing to do." "Yes, you said that," Harriet interrupted, feeling a boldness she'd never experienced before. Perhaps her brush with death had changed her somehow. "But you could have simply secured my release. You didn't have to arrange for my care, pay for my lodging, force a public apology, or threaten the sheriff. That goes well beyond what most would consider obligation." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "You're right," he finally conceded. "I suppose I felt responsible in a way." "Responsible? You had nothing to do with what happened to me." "Not directly, no." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that suggested rare uncertainty. "But I've lived in Silverpine for 8 years now. I've seen how Dalton operates, how newcomers like yourself are treated with suspicion. I've kept to my ranch and my business, told myself it wasn't my concern." His jaw tightened. "When I heard what happened to you, I couldn't look the other way. Not this time." There was something in his voice, a hint of old pain that made Harriet wonder about his past. "Mrs. Donovan mentioned that you lost your wife and son," she said softly. "I'm very sorry." A shadow crossed his face. "Thank you," he said stiffly, then seemed to force himself to continue. "Caroline and Thomas. Influenza took them both in the space of a week. Thomas was only 6 months old." "That's terrible," Harriet said, her heart aching for him. "I lost my parents to cholera 2 years ago. It's not the same, I know, but I understand what it's like to be alone." Ethan met her eyes, something shifting in his expression. "How did you end up in Silverpine?" "After my parents died, there was nothing left for me in Pennsylvania. Our farm was heavily mortgaged, and once the debts were paid, I had just enough for a train ticket west." She smiled wryly. "I had this notion that the West offered opportunities for a fresh start. I stopped in Silverpine because I ran out of money." "And you found work at Jenkins' store?" Harriet nodded. "It wasn't much, but it paid for my room and board. I was saving, hoping to eventually have enough to move on to California." "And now," Ethan asked, "will you stay in Silverpine?" She hesitated. "I don't know, after what happened. I'm not sure how welcome I'll be, even with Mr. Jenkins' apology." "The town will come around," Ethan said with conviction. "Most folks here are decent, just wary of strangers. Once they get to know you, they'll see what I—" He stopped abruptly, a faint color rising in his cheeks. Harriet felt her own face grow warm. "And what do you see, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, Mrs. Donovan bustled back into the dining room, carrying a pie. "Apple and cinnamon," she announced cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the tension between her guests. "Best cure for what ails you, I always say." The moment was broken, but as they ate their dessert, Harriet was acutely aware of Ethan's gaze returning to her face when he thought she wasn't looking. Something had shifted between them, a connection forming that went beyond rescuer and rescued. As he prepared to leave after the meal, Ethan paused at the boarding house door. "I need to return to my ranch. My foreman can only manage on his own for so long in this weather, but I'd like to call on you again, if I may." Harriet felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. "I'd like that," she replied simply. He nodded, a small smile softening his features before he stepped out into the cold December afternoon, leaving Harriet with the strange feeling that her life had somehow changed course in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. 3 days passed before Harriet saw Ethan again. The weather had worsened, with another heavy snowfall making travel between town and the outlying ranches difficult. She spent her time recovering her strength, helping Mrs. Donovan with light chores around the boarding house to ward off restlessness, and wondering when or if Ethan would return as promised. On the morning of the 4th day, Harriet felt well enough to venture into town. The general store was her destination. Though Mr. Jenkins had promised her job back, she wanted to discuss the terms of her return face to face. The bell above the door jingled as she entered the store. Mr. Jenkins looked up from behind the counter, his expression changing from shopkeeper's welcome to nervous recognition. "Miss Turner," he said, coming around to meet her. "I'm glad to see you recovered." "I want to apologize again for it's all right, Mr. Jenkins," Harriet interrupted gently. "I understand it was a misunderstanding. I've come to ask about resuming my position." Relief washed over the storekeeper's face. Of course, whenever you're ready. And as I said, with an increase in wages." They settled the details, with Harriet agreeing to start back the following Monday, giving her a few more days to fully regain her strength. As she turned to leave, Mr. Jenkins called after her. "Miss Turner, you should know that Mr. Reynolds came by yesterday, bought out nearly half my store's winter supplies." Harriet paused, curious. "Oh," Jenkins nodded. "Said he was donating it to families who might be struggling this winter. Had my boys load up 3 wagons full of flour, sugar, coffee, preserved meats, wool blankets, you name it." "That was generous of him," Harriet said, surprised by this new information about Ethan. "Indeed it was. Never done anything like that before, though he's always been fair in his dealings." Jenkins gave her a meaningful look. "Mentioned your name, he did. Said talking to you had reminded him of what was important." Harriet felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, the store door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the very man they'd been discussing. Ethan stopped short at the sight of her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He appeared different somehow. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt under his heavy coat. "Miss Turner," he said, removing his hat. "It's good to see you up and about." "Mr. Reynolds," she replied, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and hastily arranged hair. "I was just discussing my return to work with Mr. Jenkins." "I'm glad to hear it." His eyes never left her face. "I've been meaning to call on you, but the weather." He gestured vaguely toward the window, where snowflakes were visible against the gray sky. Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "I just remembered some inventory I need to check in the back," he said, making a hasty retreat that fooled neither of them. Left alone, Harriet and Ethan stood in awkward silence for a moment. "I heard about your generosity," Harriet finally said. "Mr. Jenkins told me about the supplies." Ethan shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "There are families who struggle every winter. I should have done something sooner." "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said softly, echoing his own words from days before. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look younger, less careworn. "I was hoping you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tonight," he said. "That is, if you're feeling strong enough." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I'd be delighted," Harriet replied, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect. "I'll call for you at 6 then," Ethan said, replacing his hat. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and left the store. Mrs. Donovan was beside herself with excitement when Harriet returned and shared the news of her dinner invitation. "Well now, this is a development," the older woman said. eyes twinkling as she rummaged through a trunk in her room. "Let's see if we can't find you something more suitable to wear than my old things. I've kept some of my daughter's dresses. She's married and living in San Francisco now, but she left behind a few nice pieces that might fit you." The dress Mrs. Donovan produced was a deep forest green with a modest neckline and trim of darker velvet, far nicer than anything Harriet had owned since leaving Pennsylvania. It fit well enough with only minor adjustments, and when Mrs. Donovan helped her arrange her hair in a simple but elegant style, Harriet hardly recognized her reflection in the mirror. "There," Mrs. Donovan said with satisfaction. "Mr. Reynolds won't know what hit him." Precisely at 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the boarding house door. Mrs. Donovan answered it, ushering Ethan into the small parlor where Harriet waited. The look on his face when he saw her made all the fussing worthwhile. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "Miss Turner," he finally said, his voice deeper than usual. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Harriet replied, accepting the arm he offered. "And please call me Harriet." "Harriet," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Then you must call me Ethan." The Silver Pine Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, which wasn't saying much compared to Eastern standards, but the food was good and the atmosphere pleasant. Heads turned as they entered Ethan Reynolds' dining with anyone was unusual enough, but his companion, being the woman who'd been wrongfully imprisoned just days ago, made their appearance the most interesting thing to happen in Silver Pine in months. If Ethan noticed the stares and whispers, he gave no indication. He led Harriet to a table in a quiet corner, holding her chair with old-fashioned courtesy, before taking his own seat. Over dinner, a hearty venison stew for him. Roasted chicken for her. They talked with increasing ease. Ethan told her about his ranch, the challenges and rewards of raising cattle in the Colorado mountains. "It was Caroline's father's place originally," he explained. "When we married, he was getting too old to manage it alone, so we moved from Denver to help. After he passed, it came to us. When I lost Caroline and Thomas, well, the ranch was all I had left." "It must be beautiful there," Harriet said, trying to picture it. "It is," Ethan agreed, a warmth entering his voice. "Especially in spring when the wildflowers carpet the meadows and the new calves are finding their legs. Even in winter, there's a stark beauty to it." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Perhaps you'd like to see it sometime." The invitation hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond a simple social call. Harriet met his gaze steadily. "I'd like that very much," she replied. As they finished their meal, the hotel owner approached their table, a portly man with a nervous smile. "Mr. Reynolds, Miss Turner, I hope everything was to your satisfaction." "Excellent as always, Mr. Hoffman," Ethan assured him. "Good, good." The man hesitated. "Miss Turner, I want to apologize for what happened to you. Not all of us in Silver Pine are so quick to judge newcomers. I hope you won't hold it against our town." Harriet was touched by the unexpected apology. "Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. I appreciate that." After he left, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You see, things are changing already. Word of what happened to you and how close you came to serious harm has made many people reconsider how this town treats outsiders." "Thanks to you," Harriet pointed out. Ethan shook his head. "I may have spoken up, but it's your dignity and forgiveness that's making the real impression." His expression grew more serious. "Harriet, there's something I need to ask you." Before he could continue, the restaurant door burst open, and a young man rushed in, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Ethan. "Mr. Reynolds," he called, hurrying over. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's trouble at the ranch." One of the line shacks caught fire and some of the men were inside. Jim sent me to fetch you right away." Ethan was on his feet immediately, all trace of the relaxed dinner companion gone, replaced by a man of action. "Anyone hurt?" "Two men with burns, sir." "Nothing life-threatening, but Doc Miller should see them." Ethan turned to Harriet, regret clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry I have to go." "Of course," she said quickly. "Your men need you." "I'll have to ride back tonight," he said, helping her with her shawl. "The trail will be dangerous in the dark, but I can't delay." Outside the hotel, Ethan's horse was already waiting, held by the messenger. The animal stamped impatiently, breath forming clouds in the cold night air. "I'll escort you back to Mrs. Donovan's first," Ethan said, but Harriet shook her head. "Don't waste precious minutes. It's only a short walk and the streets are well lit tonight." She placed a hand on his arm. "Go to your men. They need you more than I do right now." Ethan hesitated, clearly torn, then made a decision. He took her hand in his, pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture that sent warmth coursing through her despite the cold. "I'll come back as soon as I can," he promised. Then he was mounting his horse, giving her one last look before spurring the animal into motion, riding out of town at a gallop with the messenger following close behind. Harriet watched until they disappeared into the darkness, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, wondering what he had been about to ask her before they were interrupted. A week passed with no word from Ethan. Harriet returned to work at the general store, where Mr. Jenkins was almost obsequiously accommodating, and found herself welcomed by most of the customers. Some still regarded her with suspicion, but many went out of their way to be kind, as if making up for the town's collective failure to protect her. Sheriff Dalton kept his distance, though rumors circulated that the federal marshal's impending visit had him seriously worried. Tommy Jenkins, the actual culprit behind the theft, had been put to work making amends by cleaning the store after hours and helping with deliveries. Every day, Harriet found herself watching the road that led from the direction of Ethan's ranch, hoping to see a familiar figure on horseback. Each night, she returned to her room at the boarding house with a mixture of disappointment and worry. What if he'd been injured at the ranch? What if his interest in her had been merely temporary, born of pity rather than genuine attraction? Mrs. Donovan tried to reassure her. "Ranching is demanding work, especially in winter," she said. "And with injured men to look after, he'll have his hands full." On the 8th day after their dinner, a severe blizzard hit Silver Pine, shutting down the town completely. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and bitter winds made venturing outdoors dangerous. Harriet and Mrs. Donovan, along with the boarding house's 3 other residents, spent 2 days huddled around the fireplace, rationing their firewood and food supplies. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally abated, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Men emerged to start the laborious process of digging out doorways and clearing paths. Harriet was helping Mrs. Donovan prepare breakfast when they heard commotion outside. Looking through the frost-edged window, they saw a group of riders coming into town, leading pack horses laden with bundles. "It's Ethan," Harriet exclaimed, recognizing the lead rider despite his heavy winter gear. Mrs. Donovan peered over her shoulder. "And he's brought supplies. Bless that man." They watched as the riders stopped in the town square. Ethan dismounted and began directing his men to distribute the bundles: food, firewood, and other necessities for families affected by the storm. Harriet didn't wait for an invitation. She grabbed her coat and hurried outside, making her way through the snow toward the activity in the square. Ethan saw her coming and broke away from his men, meeting her halfway. His face was wind-burned, with several days' growth of beard, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Harriet," he said, his voice rough with fatigue, "Are you all right? The storm we managed," she assured him. "But you look exhausted. Been a rough week," he admitted. "Two injured men to care for, then the blizzard hit us hard. We lost some cattle in the high pastures, but most of the herd is safe." He gestured toward the supplies. "Once we could get through, I wanted to make sure the town had what it needed." "That's very generous," she said, touched by his concern for the community. Ethan shrugged. "Many hands make light work. My men were glad to help." He paused, studying her face. "I wanted to come sooner, to finish our conversation." Harriet felt her heart quicken. "I'd given up hope of seeing you again so soon, with the weather being what it was." "It would take more than a blizzard to keep me away," he said, his voice dropping lower so that only she could hear. "Harriet, I need to ask you something, and I don't want any more interruptions." Before he could continue, one of his ranch hands approached. "Boss, where do you want these medical supplies delivered? Doc Miller's or the general store?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly in frustration, then answered, "Take them to Doc Miller. He'll know who needs them most." The ranch hand nodded and left, but already others were approaching with questions about the distribution of the remaining supplies. Ethan turned back to Harriet with a look of determination. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. He led her away from the square, toward the small church at the end of the main street. The building was quiet and empty, its steps recently cleared of snow. Inside, the air was cold but still, a peaceful sanctuary away from the bustle outside. In the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows, Ethan finally faced Harriet without interruption. He still held her hand, his grip gentle but secure. "Harriet," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the empty church. "I've been alone for 5 years, convinced that was how I would spend the rest of my life. I didn't want or need anyone else. Then you came along, and something changed." Harriet hardly dared breathe, watching the play of emotions across his face. "When I found you in that jail cell, half frozen and still showing more courage than most men I know, something woke up in me. Something I thought had died with Caroline." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I know it's sudden. We've hardly spent any time together." "You probably think I'm crazy. I don't," Harriet interrupted softly. "I feel it too." Hope flickered in his eyes. "What I wanted to ask you at dinner that night. What I've been wanting to ask since the moment I carried you out of that cell. Harriet, would you consider coming to stay at my ranch? Not as a guest, but as more. I have a large house, plenty of room. You'd have your own quarters, complete privacy. I wouldn't presume anything. I want the chance to court you properly, to see if what I'm feeling might grow into something lasting." It was an unconventional proposal, but then, nothing about their acquaintance had been conventional. Harriet considered his offer, aware that her answer could change the course of her life. "What about my job at the store?" she asked, buying time to sort through her thoughts. "You could keep it if you wish. I'd bring you to town whenever you wanted." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. "Or you could help at the ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, isn't getting any younger. She could use an assistant." Harriet thought about her life, before coming to Silverpine, the loss of her parents, the lonely journey west, the struggle to make her way in a world that often seemed indifferent to a woman on her own. Then she thought of Ethan, who had shown her more kindness and respect in a few days than most had shown her in years. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." Relief and joy transformed Ethan's face. For a moment, he looked like he might kiss her, but instead he brought her hand to his lips again, a gesture of both restraint and promise. "When the weather clears enough for safe travel, I'll come for you," he said. "A week, perhaps 2. "I'll be ready," Harriet replied, knowing in her heart that she was making the right choice. As they stepped back outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long blue shadows across the snow and making the world glitter as if strewn with diamonds. It felt, to Harriet, like a blessing on their new beginning. The journey to Ethan's ranch took place 10 days later, when the trails were finally clear enough for the buckboard wagon he brought to town. Harriet's possessions were few-some clothes, books, and small keepsakes from her parents, so packing took little time. Mrs. Donovan hugged her tightly before she left. "You've landed on your feet, girl," the older woman said with approval. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon." The December landscape was breathtaking as they traveled, the mountains rising majestically around them, evergreens heavy with snow creating a Christmas card scene. Harriet sat close to Ethan on the wagon seat, a thick buffalo robe across their laps for warmth. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing at the wilderness surrounding them. "Wait until you see the ranch," Ethan replied, a note of pride in his voice. "It's nothing fancy like some of the big cattle barons have, but it's solid and comfortable." "How many acres do you have?" Harriet asked, realizing she knew very little about the practical aspects of his life. "About 5,000, mostly grazing land with some timber. We run close to 2,000 head of cattle in good years." He glanced at her. "Does that impress you?" Harriet laughed. "Should it?" "Some women would be calculating the worth right now," he said with a wry smile. "I'm not some women," she replied simply. His smile widened. "No, you're certainly not." As they crested a rise, the Reynolds ranch came into view, a large 2-story house of solid timber construction, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and even from a distance, Harriet could see men moving about, tending to the daily work of the ranch. "Home," Ethan said softly, urging the horses forward. They were greeted in the yard by a weathered man in his 50s, who Ethan introduced as Jim Hollister, his foreman, and a plump, gray-haired woman who emerged from the house wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Harriet Turner," Ethan said. "The lady I told you about." The housekeeper examined Harriet with frank curiosity but a kind expression. "Welcome to the ranch, Miss Turner. I've prepared the east bedroom for you. It gets the morning sun, very cheerful." "Thank you," Harriet replied, immediately liking the straightforward woman. The house was indeed solid and comfortable, with large rooms, sturdy furniture, and an atmosphere of quiet prosperity. It wasn't ostentatious, but everything was of good quality and well maintained. The east bedroom proved to be a lovely space with windows overlooking the mountains, a 4-poster bed, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe that dwarfed Harriet's modest collection of clothing. "I hope it suits you," Ethan said, hovering in the doorway as Harriet explored her new quarters. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Far nicer than anywhere I've lived in years." Dinner that night was a slightly awkward affair, with Harriet, Ethan, and Mrs. Abernathy seated at a table large enough for 12. The housekeeper kept the conversation flowing with questions about Silverpine and comments about the ranch, while Ethan seemed content to watch Harriet, a small smile playing about his lips whenever she glanced his way. After the meal, they sat in the parlor before a roaring fire, the comfort of the room contrasting sharply with Harriet's memory of the cold jail cell where their story had begun. "Are you happy with your decision to come here?" Ethan asked, as Mrs. Abernathy excused herself for the evening. "It's only been a few hours," Harriet pointed out with a smile, "but yes, I think I made the right choice." "Good," he hesitated. "Harriet, I want to be clear about something. When I said I wanted to court you, I meant it. I'm not looking for, that is, my intentions are honorable." Harriet felt her cheeks warm. "I never doubted that. Some might question the propriety of your living here, unchaperoned except for Mrs. Abernathy." "I'm not concerned with what some might think," Harriet said firmly. I trust you, Ethan. And after nearly freezing to death, I find I have less patience for social conventions that don't serve any real purpose." He laughed at that, the sound warming her more than the fire. "You're unlike any woman I've ever known," he said. "Most would be horrified at the mere suggestion of reputation damage. I've been accused of theft and locked in a freezing cell. I think my reputation in Silverpine has already seen its worst days." Ethan sobered at the reminder. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "I'm not," Harriet said, surprising herself with the realization. "If it hadn't, we might never have met, or at least never truly spoken to each other." "A high price for an introduction," he observed. "Worth it, I think," she replied softly. In the firelight, their eyes met and held, the connection between them almost tangible. Ethan leaned forward slightly, but then seemed to check himself, sitting back in his chair. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rougher than before. "You must be tired after the journey." Harriet nodded, recognizing his restraint for what it was: respect, not indifference. "Good night, Ethan, and thank you for everything." "Good night, Harriet," he replied, remaining seated as she rose and left the room, feeling his eyes following her until she was out of sight. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Harriet helped Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks during the mornings, learning the routines of ranch life. In the afternoons, she often accompanied Ethan as he made his rounds of the property, riding beside him on a gentle mare he'd selected for her from his small remuda of horses. These rides became the highlight of her days. Ethan was a patient teacher, showing her the boundaries of his land, explaining the cycle of cattle ranching, pointing out wildlife and plants she'd never seen before. More importantly, he shared stories of his life, his childhood in Denver as the son of a banker, his education back east, his return to Colorado and meeting Caroline. In turn, Harriet told him about her own past, her happy childhood on a small Pennsylvania farm, her brief time at a ladies' seminary before her parents' illness called her home, her struggles after their deaths. "I never expected to find happiness again," she admitted one crisp January afternoon as they rested their horses atop a ridge overlooking a valley where Ethan's cattle grazed in the distance. "After losing my parents, I just focused on survival." "I understand that feeling," Ethan said quietly. "After Caroline and Thomas died, getting through each day was achievement enough." "And now?" Harriet asked, searching his face, his eyes, as blue as the winter sky above them, met hers steadily. "Now I find myself looking forward to tomorrow and the day after that, because of you." The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, but Ethan was true to his word about courting her properly. He never entered her bedroom, never touched her beyond taking her hand to help her onto her horse or offering his arm as they walked. Each night, he bid her a formal good night at the foot of the stairs, though the look in his eyes suggested he wished for more. January gave way to February, bringing even colder temperatures but also a sense of deepening connection between them. Harriet had been at the ranch for 6 weeks when Ethan suggested they ride into Silverpine for supplies and to attend the Valentine's Day dance at the town hall. "A dance?" Harriet asked, surprised. "I wouldn't have thought you'd enjoy such things." "I haven't attended one since Caroline died," he admitted, "but I find I'd like to dance with you." The trip to town was enlightening. Where Harriet had once been regarded with suspicion by many of Silverpine's residents, she was now greeted with friendly curiosity, her association with Ethan Reynolds elevating her status considerably. "Mrs. Donovan welcomed her with open arms, insisting she and Ethan stay for tea and catching Harriet up on all the town gossip. "Sheriff Dalton's resigned," the older woman reported with satisfaction. Left town right after that federal marshal's visit last month. Good riddance, I say. We have a new lawman coming from Denver next week. Shopping at the general store was another revelation. Mr. Jenkins was effusive in his welcome, offering them the best prices on everything they needed, while his son Tommy worked diligently at stocking shelves, occasionally casting ashamed glances in Harriet's direction. The boys straightened out, Jenkins confided to them. That scare with you made him realize the consequences of his actions. He's working hard to make amends. That evening, dressed in a new blue gown Ethan had insisted on purchasing for her. Consider it a Valentine's gift, he'd said when she protested the expense. Harriet entered the town hall on his arm. The building had been transformed with paper hearts and ribbons. A small band played in one corner, and nearly the entire population of Silver Pine seemed to be in attendance. Conversation lulled briefly as they entered, many eyes turning their way. Ethan, normally so private, stood tall beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm, a clear statement of his intentions that wasn't lost on the onlookers. "Shall we dance?" he asked as the musicians began a waltz. Harriet hadn't danced since before her parents' deaths, but her body remembered the steps. Ethan led confidently, his hand warm at her waist, maintaining a proper distance between them that nevertheless felt intimate in the crowded room. "Everyone is watching us," Harriet murmured, aware of the curious gazes following their movements. "Let them watch," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm proud to be seen with you." As the evening progressed, others approached them, ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, the new schoolteacher who had arrived in January. Harriet was introduced as Miss Turner, who's staying at my ranch, a description that raised a few eyebrows but prompted no open criticism. During a break in the dancing, while Ethan was speaking with some of the other ranchers about cattle prices, Harriet found herself approached by a stylishly dressed woman in her 30s. "Miss Turner, I'm Margaret Sinclair," the woman introduced herself. "My husband owns the bank here in Silver Pine. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Sinclair," Harriet replied, wondering at the woman's intent. "I knew Caroline Reynolds," Margaret continued, watching Harriet closely. "We were friends before her passing." "I see," Harriet said cautiously. Ethan was devastated by her death. For years, we all worried he'd never emerge from his grief. Margaret's gaze softened. "It's good to see him living again instead of just existing. You've accomplished what none of us could." Before Harriet could respond to this unexpected confidence, Ethan returned to her side, nodding politely to Margaret before asking Harriet for another dance. As they moved around the floor, Harriet found herself studying his face with new awareness. The lines of grief that had been so prominent when they first met seemed less deep now, his expression more open, his rare smiles coming more frequently. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her thoughtful gaze. "That you're different from the man who found me in that jail cell," she replied honestly. "Better or worse?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. "Happier, I think," she said. "At least I hope so." His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "You know why that is, don't you?" The heat in his eyes made her breath catch. "Ethan." "I love you, Harriet," he said quietly, the words almost lost in the music but their impact resounding through her entire being. "I think I have since that first night when you insisted I go to my injured men instead of escorting you home. Your courage, your kindness, your strength. Everything about you calls to something in me I thought was dead and buried." Harriet felt tears pricking at her eyes, joy expanding in her chest until she thought it might burst. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon. Life is too short for such fears." Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I lost 5 years to grief and isolation. I don't want to waste another day." When they returned to the ranch that night, the air between them was charged with unspoken promise. At the foot of the stairs, where Ethan usually bid her good night, he instead took both her hands in his. "Harriet," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want to do this properly. Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children." Though she had begun to hope for such a proposal, the reality of it still took her breath away. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Ethan, I will." His face transformed with joy, and for the first time he drew her into his arms. The kiss they shared was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that left them both breathless. "I should go," he said reluctantly when they finally parted, his forehead resting against hers. "If I don't leave now." Harriet understood. They had agreed to wait, to do things properly, and despite their engagement, that hadn't changed. "Good night, Ethan," she said softly. "I'll see you in the morning." "Good night, my love," he replied, pressing one more kiss to her hand before watching her ascend the stairs. That night, lying in her bed with her fingers touching her lips where his had been, Harriet reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. A false accusation, hours of suffering in a freezing cell, and the unexpected intervention of a grieving rancher had changed the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The wedding took place in April, when the mountain spring was in full bloom, wildflowers carpeting the meadows around the ranch just as Ethan had once described to her. They were married in the small church in Silver Pine, with Mrs. Donovan, Mrs. Abernathy, and Jim Hollister as their witnesses, and the new minister officiating. Harriet wore a gown of ivory satin that Margaret Sinclair had helped her select on a shopping trip to Denver, while Ethan looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit, his face cleanly shaved, and his blue eyes bright with happiness as they spoke their vows. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, a testament to how much had changed since that cold December night when Harriet had huddled, forgotten, in the unheated jail cell. Sheriff Dalton's replacement, a fair-minded former Army officer named Captain Roberts, was among the well-wishers, as was Mr. Jenkins and his now reformed son. As evening fell and the party continued, Ethan drew Harriet away from the crowd, leading her to a quiet spot behind the church where they could see the mountains bathed in the golden light of sunset. "Happy, Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Very," she replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "Though it still seems like a dream sometimes. That night in the jail, I thought I might die there. I never imagined I'd find such happiness because of it. I thank God every day that I heard about what happened to you," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That I wasn't too late. You kept me warm," Harriet said softly, remembering the feel of his coat around her shoulders, his arms carrying her through the snow. "Not just that night, but every day since. And I intend to keep doing so for the rest of our lives," he promised, turning her in his arms to kiss her properly, the mountains bearing silent witness to their happiness. In the years that followed, Ethan kept that promise. They faced challenges together, drought years that threatened the ranch, a difficult first pregnancy that left Harriet bedridden for months, the normal conflicts that arise between two strong-willed individuals building a life together, but through it all, the bond between them only strengthened. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Harriet's father, was born in the spring of 1877, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth. The house that had once echoed with Ethan's solitary footsteps now rang with children's laughter and the bustling activity of family life. Harriet never forgot those hours in the cold cell, the experience that had brought her and Ethan together. Each winter, on the anniversary of that day, they made a special donation to families in need in Silver Pine, ensuring that no one went without warmth or food during the harsh Colorado winters. And each night, no matter how many years passed, Ethan would hold her close as they fell asleep, his arms a shelter against any cold that might threaten, his love a warmth that sustained her through all seasons. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they stood on the porch of the ranch house watching their children, now young adults, helping with the spring roundup, Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist, just as he had on countless occasions before. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if Sheriff Dalton hadn't locked you in that cell?" he asked, his hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes as clear and loving as ever. "Sometimes," Harriet admitted, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But I've never regretted it, not for a moment. Even in my darkest hour, something good was waiting to find me." She looked up at him, at the face she had loved for 2 decades. "You were waiting to find me." Ethan smiled, the special smile he reserved only for her, and bent to kiss her, his lips as warm and loving as they had been on their wedding day. "And I'll keep finding you," he promised, "every day for all the days we have left." In that moment, with the Rocky Mountains standing sentinel around them and the ranch stretching out before them, a legacy they had built together, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that the bitter cold of that long-ago December night had led her to the warmest place she could ever have hoped to find, in the arms of the man who had saved her, the man who had loved her, the man who had kept her warm for the rest of her life.